Hello, welcome to my YouTube channel. My name's Connie. I'm a furniture painter. I'm also a brand ambassador for Dixie Belle Paint. If you followed me for a second, you might know that my favourite colour is green. I adore painting in green, and I've been waiting to try a brand new colour from the Terra Clay Paint range from Dixie Belle called Pistachio. So that is the main colour that I've used on this side table behind me, and I'm going to show you how I did it. Okay, first things first, as always, we're going to fast forward through this bit because it's, you know, it's got to be done, but it's also pretty boring. I'm going to clean the piece. So whenever you buy a piece of furniture to paint, it's always best to give it a good clean first. That's going to get rid of anything on the surface that's going to stop your paint from sticking. So I have mixed a solution of Dixie Belle's White Lightning Cleaner and water in a spray bottle. I've spritzed it all over, given it a good scrub, and then rinsed it with clean warm water to remove any of the cleaning product afterwards. Next thing to do is to give your piece a scuff sand. Now you can either do this with an electric sander if you have one. I'm using mine because I work inside, but you can also do it by hand as well. And the aim is just to give the surface a quick scuff up so that you are not painting directly onto a very shiny surface, and that just gives the paint something to grip onto. Also, can we take a moment to appreciate my tree frog green Crocs? And you'll notice that I am scuff sanding, that I've prepped basically the entire piece. So I am going to be painting the back of this piece. Don't always paint the backs of pieces, but because this is quite a small piece and it's one of those that could be placed anywhere in a room, I am going to paint the back of it. Okay, so I'm actually going to start with Silk Mineral Paint in the colour Mojave, and I'm going to use that as a sort of base coat. Now, you don't have to do that with Terra, you don't need to use a base coat at all, but it is a no rules paint, so any of the other paints in the Dixie Belle range work really well with Terra. And because Terra is very easily reactivated with water, or when you apply a second coat of paint over the top, if you layer in, etc., you can reactivate the paint underneath. So I'm going to give this a really solid base coat. This is kind of the tonal sort of range that I'm going for, so sort of yellowy greens, lime colours. So for that reason, I'm giving it a base coat of silk. Silk works excellently, is that a word? As a base coat for Terra Clay Paint as just chalk mineral paint. And it just means that instead of when it reactivates, when you're adding layers and layers of Terra over the top, instead of it reactivating and you seeing wood underneath, you're going to see the base colour that you've added, in my case, which is Mojave. Okay, so now I've allowed the silk to dry, and I'm going to start placing my Terra Clay Paint in the sort of areas that I want it. So the first colour that I'm starting out with is called Malachite, which is a deep green. If you see me talking to myself, it's only because I was doing a live video and I wanted to record it so that I could edit this into the YouTube video at a later date. So I am actually live as well as recording it. So you can see the pistachios going on the drawer front. I'm not precious about, you know, keeping this really sort of clean lines or anything. I am literally just placing the colours in sort of rough, I'm sort of roughly mapping out the colours where I want them. So I want deeper sort of greens around the edges to create shading, and then I want the sort of lighter colours in the centre to be a sort of a highlighter, if you like. So I want pistachio to be the main colour on this piece, but I also want a really kind of layered, and I want to create some depth to the tones of the colours. So I don't want it to be a one colour finish. So that is why I'm starting out with these kind of different shades in hope that it's going to give me a little bit of tonal range. It's not just going to be one flat finish. So as I mentioned, I'm just keeping this kind of tonal. There's not going to be any contrasting colours to this. I'm keeping it all within the kind of yellows and greens. So I'm using Wheat, which is a muted yellow, for the highlight in the centre of the drawers. And again, I'm not too bothered about blending it into the other colours at the moment. I'm just placing those colours in almost like blocky areas, just to kind of map out where I want those colours to be. So that's the top section, and I'm going to apply pretty much the same technique to the bottom drawer as well, mapping my colours with the darkest around the edges, then using Pistachio across the centre of the drawer and highlighting it with a little bit of Wheat in the middle. Okay, back to the top drawer. So you remember me saying I wanted Pistachio to be the sort of main feature colour-wise on this piece. The reason I've added dark and light colours as well is just to create a little bit of tonal variation, just so that it's not one flat colour. So when I am applying my next layers of colour, it's just going to create a little bit more richness and depth. So I'm going back in with Pistachio, and I'm now kind of blending it in a little bit more with the rest of the colours. So the initial colours were just to kind of map out where I wanted them. So now I'm introducing water, and I'm also just getting those colours to sort of merge in together. I'm not looking for a really perfect blend on this. You know my style. It's more sort of a little bit rough and ready, a little bit bohemian, a little bit more layered. So that's the kind of look that I'm going for on this. So I'm just layering up those colours and just getting them to melt together a little bit using water. Then the next thing I did, which I'm not really sure why I did it, but I did it, I used a wash of the colour Wheat over the top of my sort of dried down base colour, if you like. I genuinely don't think it really added much to the piece, but I'm showing you what I did so that you can kind of see the process. So as you can see, I don't really think the Wheat added much, but it's a very experimental paint, a very creative paint, and you kind of have to play around with looks in order to get the desired outcome. So not necessarily something that I'd repeat if I wanted the same finish again. I think you could probably skip the wash of Wheat, if I'm honest. So now I'm just going over the entire piece with Pistachio. So again, I'm just going over the deeper colours, and I don't want it to be sort of like a deep green piece. I want more of a limey colour. So I'm going over there, using a little bit of water to water it down, and just making Pistachio the main colour. So I let this dry down overnight because I'm really liking how it's looking, and I didn't want to keep adding to it and all the colours kind of getting smushed. But I do feel it is quite clean looking, and I want to sort of add a little bit of grunge or mute the colours or add a little bit of depth or something. And there isn't a brown in the range, but I really do want to introduce that kind of colour somehow, I think. So I had a little experiment, and I have tried mixing brown, sort of like muted browny colours. So this one here is Marigold and Cerulean Blue, which is actually coming out fairly green, which is actually a really nice colour. This one is Elderberry and Wheat, which is more of a taupey colour. And then this one is Daffodil and Elderberry, which is like a very similar colour to Pine Cone, I'd say, in the chalk mineral paint range. And I feel like that's going to add nice depth without being too dark. I don't want to use black, but I just feel like that might add a bit of depth. So I'm going to go ahead and mix some brown and add some shading. So usually to create brown, what you'd need is 3 primary colours, which are red, yellow and blue. And when you mix them together in roughly equal parts, you'd get brown. I don't have a red, so I have used 2 complementary colours. That's why I've used Elderberry and Daffodil, and that has got me the sort of brown colour that I'm using. I'm using a premium chip brush because up until now I've been using the Belle brush, which the bristles are slightly more compact on the Belle brush, so it gives you really good coverage at the same time as being a natural bristle brush, so you get all that lovely texture that I like. A premium chip brush, the bristles are a little bit more sparse and spaced out, so it's really good for adding a little bit of dry brush kind of detail like I'm doing here. I'm not using any water. I'm using a very, very small amount of paint just to build up that shading around the drawer edges. So I'm just adding this in very sort of gradual layers until I get the look that I want. And remember, this does look quite extreme at the minute, but I am going to be layering greens over the top so that it's kind of soften that harshness of that brown, because at the minute it does kind of look a little bit odd. But stick with the process, bear with me. So if you didn't want such an extreme contrast to that brown, remember you can add water to this. You can water it down, or you can introduce water via a mister bottle, and that's just going to dilute it down and it's not going to be quite so harsh. So anywhere that I wanted shading, I applied the sort of brown colour that I mixed. In the sort of recesses of the side panels, you can see that I've kind of done the same thing, and I've just added it around the edges here and then blended it out in the centre with a little bit of pistachio so that it's not quite such a harsh line on the side panels, just that it's a little bit more subtle. So you can see that it's sort of more prominent in areas and less so in others. That's kind of what I want. And you can see how little paint that I'm using as I'm going over the top of this brown. So this colour, I'm back to pistachio. I'm just building up the layers of pistachio over that brown. I still want the brown to kind of come through and act as shading, so I am using water, and I'm just being really careful not to kind of get the two colours to mix too much together. I do want a more layered look. So the drier your brush and the less water you introduce, the less likely you are to reactivate those colours underneath and get them to merge, because I don't want this to go all muddy and kind of lose its depth and the tonal range. I don't want obviously this to all become one kind of flat colour again. So I'm just layering the pistachio very, very gradually over the top. I'm also using little pops of wheat, and I also use some daffodil for a little bit more of a brighter pop of yellow in the centre of the drawers. So because I want pistachio to be the kind of main colour on this, I went over the entire piece with pistachio using a little bit of water so that it's not quite such a solid colour, and you can still see the other colours coming through underneath to keep that tonal variation. But I do want pistachio to be the main colour, so I went over it all using a natural bristle brush and a water mister, and again just kind of layering it, blending it, playing around with it until I get the look that I wanted. So then I waited for that to dry for 24 hours, and I'm going to basically finish it off with a top coat. But before that, I'm just going to add a little bit of distress into this piece just to give it a little bit of character, and because it's something that I like to do. Distressing is personal preference, I think. Some people like it, some people not so much. I personally do like it, so I'm using a 120 grit paper to just rough up some of the corners, the edges of the drawers. I just think it helps define drawers and just basically adds to the character. But like I say, it's personal preference, not for everyone. I'm going to seal this with gator hide, and I'm using a synthetic brush to apply it with. I don't have the Terra wax yet. I think this is the next best thing to Terra wax, because not all top coats are compatible with this paint. Best down wax is not advised to use with this paint because it's water based, and as you know, water can reactivate this paint. So when you are top coating with best down wax, what you need to do to a wax is kind of rub it in quite well to the paint, and obviously it's that motion, that kind of rubbing it in, that can reactivate the paint. Because I'm using Gator Hide, it is a water-based product, but it allows you to lay the product quite quickly over the surface without having to rub that surface too much. So a couple of hints when you're using Gator Hide. I am using a dry brush. I'm not using a sponge. Again, it can drag and cause the paint to reactivate. So I'm using a brush, a super light hand, and I'm just placing it on and leaving it alone. I'm not going to kind of play around with it too much, and I'm just trying to do really long, smooth strokes with my brush. And you can see how by adding a top coat, it's just bringing all the vibrancy of the colours back, basically to how it was when those colours were wet before they dried down. If you are unsure how your piece is going to look when you add a top coat, you can always mist it with water, and that gives you a pretty good indication of how it's going to look when you've applied your top coat. And here's a couple of corner shots so I can show you the detail. Hopefully you can see how much that kind of custom brown comes into play and helps with shading. And here's the final shot with my trusty chair and some red apples. As always, thank you for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you've got any questions, drop them in the comments below. I always read the comments and get back to you. And make sure you subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching. Bye.